It's great to see you all here, and I have to say it was fun seeing all the names trickle in. Lots of names I recognized from lots of different places, and lots of new names too. So really pleased to see you all here. For folks I don't know, my name is Sarah Kerr, and I'm a death doula and a ritual healing practitioner in Calgary, and I'm going to talk about the shamanic archetype, and everything will become, I think, clear to you as I proceed. But I want to start with honoring both this place and this time, because it's an interesting combination of both. And first of all, to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 7 territory, and that this is the traditional home of the Stoney Nakoda, the First Nations, including the Bearspaw, the Chiniki, the Wesley First Nations, the Siksika, the Pakunai, the Kainai, and the Tsuut'ina. And so some of us may be in some way descended from people who signed those treaties from the First Nations side. We may be descended from settlers who signed them on the settler side, or we may be newly moved to Alberta. But no matter how we are living in this land, we're treaty people. And so it's important to just begin with that opening and that recognition. And also to recognize that today is November 1st, Samhain. Sometimes it's spelled S-A-M-H-A-I-N, pronounced Samhain. And that's a Gaelic festival, the end of the harvest and the beginning of the winter. My ancestors are all Celtic, so that really resonates for me. And our traditional Halloween is an outgrowth of that. So going door to door in costume is a traditional Samhain festivity that we've then turned into Halloween. And it's understood to be a time when the veils are thin, when the dead come back, when there's a kind of reunion and a chance when families get to reunite. And so honoring that also, that we not only are in a place, but we're in a time that both matter ritually. So again, I'm a death doula and a ritual healing practitioner, and my interest is really in spiritual support for dying people and their families. And I'm interested in the healthy relationships between the living and the dead, and how keeping that in balance is a benefit and a resource to the whole community. And so when I work with families, it's about how to support the death so that the person who's dying and those who stay all go through the transitions they need to well. And everybody's moving a different part of that process, but everybody's going through some sort of transition. So I'm a practitioner, and I would say I'm also one in whom the shamanic archetype has emerged, which is a lot of mouthful, but we'll talk a lot more about this. And my introduction to this work really came through a series of really profound, spontaneous spiritual experiences that I didn't expect, didn't ask for, and I really didn't understand when they started to happen. And it was about maybe 15 or 18 years ago. It's kind of like the gates blew off and the other world became really present to me in dreams, in visions, in awareness. You know, I couldn't go grocery shopping because I could taste the food on the shelves, and I could feel and hear what people beside me were thinking on the bus. It was dreaming, precognitive dreaming, and awareness of things before they were going to happen. It was quite confusing, and it took me a long time to balance it out. And the only way I, in the end, made sense of it was through framing it as a shamanic experience. And so that's a big sort of part of where we're going to go today, is looking at what that is when that archetype activates in us. And I'm also a scholar and a researcher. I did my doctoral degree in transformative learning, which is a kind of sociology, spirituality, psychology, but it's a collective approach looking at how we change, how we become new people and learn things that increase our capacity and increase our resilience. And my dissertation was about this shamanic opening I had. It was called Dreams, Rituals, and the Creation of Shamanic Objects, a qualitative exploration of a contemporary Western shamanic initiation. There we go, mouthful indeed. And my advisor would not let me proceed until I could memorize it and spout it out. So I won't talk a whole lot about my own experiences because that's available. I wrote a huge process on it. It's all available. It's on the About page of my website, and you're welcome to read up on it there. It was a huge experience, though, and that putting it into a kind of academic framework helped me understand what was going on. And really, the focus of it was on how contemporary Western people can reconnect with these traditional ways, traditional Indigenous ways of all cultures and lands, of being in relationship with a living world, where the ancestors are present, where the spirits are present, where the land is alive. How do we engage with that in a way that's appropriate for, in my case, a white woman of Celtic descent living in North America? How do we make that juggle? So I don't call myself a shaman. I've had a lot of training in those practices, and I don't use the word because I always feel like I need to qualify it with an hour's conversation. And lo and behold, that's what we have, is the qualification, because it's complex and there are a lot of different ways to look at it, and a lot of factors involved. So, and I don't have any judgment about people who do use it. I think everyone needs to make their own path in this, and there are lots of right ways, but that's just been my own experience. So, part of what we'll be looking at tonight is some ideas I have about sort of the question, can I be a shaman if I'm a white person? Like, what is that? How does that work? How is that an Indigenous practice? How is that a universal practice? So that's sort of a little bit of an overview. This evening event is part of a series of lectures. It's the second in the series, and they'll continue again in the new year. The lectures are in support of a program I run called the Community Healers Council, which is a group that meets once a month. We meet in 3-month sections, and we meet for a full day from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. And it's really a deeply experiential exploration of, one of the ways we talk about it is that it's exploring what it would be to be a contemporary medicine society. In traditional cultures, there were people who walked between the worlds, who had access to this world and that world, and they had gathering places, and they worked together, and they learned together, and they offered checks and balances to each other. And that's, in a way, what the Healers Council is offering. How do we do this here together? And it's based a lot on the work of one of my teachers named Dina Metzger, and she has a phrase and a question she asks that really is a big guiding part of what we do in the council. And the question is, how do we become the ones the spirits trust to carry the healing into the future? And that's a big, deep question to ask. It's about how do we actually change who we are to be ones who can move forward and be part of the walkers between the worlds, of who balance this world and the other. So it's really looking at what is healing and what's the work of healing if the world is alive. So it's a community gathering, and it's a co-learning. So I don't stand at the front and teach. We have lots of activities where we're working together and exploring and connecting with the spiritual presences in this land to learn. But there's some theoretical background that's useful to know if you're in the Healers Council. So these lectures are part of that. They're going to be recorded and stored. We have an online space, so as new people join the council, they'll be able to access these lectures. But I also wanted to open it up because there are things that other people may be interested in, and sometimes people are curious about the council, and this might be a way to come and get a little taste about what it's like. So just out of curiosity, how many people here are current or past members of the Healers Council? There you go. Okay, so lots of those folks. They have little dots on their red dots on the name tag. If you're curious about it, those are people you can talk to. Yeah, and I love the experiential aspect of council, but there's a part of me that's a little bit professorial that I like this too. So it's been really exciting for me to put this together and really formulate these ideas to share. And if you're curious, this is a second lecture in the series. The first is on the principles and lineage of council, and it's actually available on the council website, and we'll send out an email tonight with a link to that. So if you're curious, you can go back and have a look at that. So I think that gives us some context. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to talk about what we talk about tonight, and some clarifications. And the first is around the paradigmatic assumptions. What are we assuming to be true about reality to have this conversation? And so what this is all based on is an assumption that we live in a spiritual ecosystem as well as a physical one. That the world is inhabited by many sentient beings of many sorts. Humans, and those people who used to be humans are some of them, but there are deities and nature spirits and fairies and devas and demons and all sorts of other beings with whom we share reality. And that being in right relationship with them is what healing is. A lot of my background is in community development, and one of the assumptions there is that everyone in the community needs a voice. And you can't exclude anyone and have a healthy community. And so I think this expands in a way to a kind of community development in all the worlds. And in my work with dying people, it's the same thing. Often we just exclude our dead, and that's detrimental to us and to the dead. So that's the first part, but then there's more. So we live in this ecosystem, we share it with many other sentient beings. And also in this system, there are non-sentient patterns of energy with which we also engage. So an archetype is a pattern of energy, a morphogenetic field, for people who are familiar with that. And my guess is that there are many, many more that we don't even understand because it's not something we in Western culture look for or discuss or have names for. But that there's a whole level of non-physical reality happening. So that's sort of the assumption that this is all based on. And then in terms of definitions, we're talking about shamanism as an archetypal phenomena rather than an anthropological one. And that's a really key differentiation. So an archetype is an innate, undeniable force in the system. And it's both an energetic pattern that we live within and that expresses itself through us. It activates within us. And the archetype of the shaman is this walker between the worlds, someone who's a specialist in relating to the unseen. And it's transcultural. It's an aspect of being human. It may even be an aspect of being more than human. Lots of indigenous teachings have understanding of there being bear shamans and badger shamans. Maybe that all our relations have a shamanic expression in them too. But it's this force that activates within us, regardless of our culture, and regardless of whether or not our culture has the resources to support that activation. So that healthy expression of the archetype of shamanism is what allows us to maintain right relationship between the worlds. It expresses in individuals, but it also, those individuals are held in a community, and that whole archetype is what's holding those worlds in balance. And it expresses whether or not we believe in it, whether or not the people around us believe in what's happening or will acknowledge it. And we have a really complex history of it in the West. It's been actively repressed and also passively neglected. It tends to fit in that whole category we call unreal, non-ordinary, supernatural, extrasensory. It's like we draw this line, and then all the things over here aren't. They just don't exist. And that's a particular cultural frame. Other cultures will say, well, everything exists. There's no line between what's real and what's not. So it's been repressed and it's been neglected in Western culture, and it's also been actively oppressed in the indigenous cultures that Western cultures have encountered, because it's a real threat to the framework of Western consciousness and what we see as real. So the premises of this talk tonight are that the archetype emerges. It just does. And that we need its energies and its capacities. So much of the mess we're in now is because we're not in right relationship with the other beings we share the world with. And that's the physical world. We're not in right relationship with the air and the water and the oil and the animals. And I would argue we're not in right relationship with the non-physical world. So we need this. We need this archetype to emerge. And we need to find healthy ways of meeting it in the collective, because we don't have those now. And we, and I'm going to say in quotation, white folks, don't have the cultural skills or the shared social patterns and the support structures to facilitate that happening. So when it does arise in our culture, and I'll talk about who are and we are in a minute, when it arises in this culture that doesn't really have space for it, it's not recognized or nurtured particularly well. So some kind of qualifications in there, that we can't talk about shamanism and the shamanic archetype without recognizing the current and historical realities of colonialism. That's just part of the conversation. And I speak as a settler. My ancestors, different directions, but there are 3, 4, 5 generations in Canada. So I'm in the line, very clearly, of people who were part of this process. And we took land, and there was a concerted effort to decimate the culture, including language and including spiritual practices. So this process actively destroyed the social container, which, among other things, had the skill to facilitate the healthy emergence of the culture. So now there's a modern social movement towards shamanism, and we have to be careful because it runs the risk of being colonial in a different kind of way. We took the land, now we're going to take the spirituality. So we have to walk very carefully in that. And that's a whole bigger question, but just sort of a word on cultural appropriation, that there have always been exchanges between cultures. The issue is when there's a power dynamic differential. So, to start a bakery selling croissants, that's a cultural mix, but there's not a power differential there. Someone sneezes, you say Gesundheit. There are ways that cultures have always merged. We do yoga, Buddhist meditation. But when there's a power differential and there's been this active repression, then we can't ignore that. And that's when it becomes tough and touchy, when we start to move things across cultural lines. So another qualification is about language and the danger of speaking in a way that universalizes, especially in a way that universalizes dominant culture. So that's also a thread through this whole process. And I want to be really aware of it and also kind of lay it out at the beginning, because as I go through, it can get a kind of tongue-tying to have to qualify everything all the way along. But I'm doing an overview qualification now. That sometimes we is we, all of us. And sometimes that's all humans, sometimes that's all everybody's. And sometimes we is dominant culture. And I recognize that there's a huge diversity underneath that gloss of dominant culture. It's not homogeneous, even though on the surface we may be judged or seen that way. But that gloss has power, that there's an accepted kind of universalized public truth, even though there's diversity within that. So in a way, I'm speaking for me and for people who that may resonate for. So that's white, Western European, of mixed ancestry, so spiritual ancestry and landscape ancestry. Humans are used to being rooted, and many of us here are not. We have a real mixed bag of landscape ancestry. And we're geographically mobile and primarily urban. So living in big, larger scale, separated from wild nature communities. So that's when I talk about dominant culture, that's sort of where I'm going around that. And I really think it's like the work that white people have to do anti-racist work. First, we have to name that we are white people. So this is a step for that. And so if what I'm saying speaks to you, take it. There's no assumptions that this is a universal truth. But I think naming it, for those of us for whom it is true, it's useful to have these conversations. And it's also a working hypothesis. It's taken a long time to destroy the cultural traditions in, say, Western European history that understood how to hold shamanism and the shamanic archetype. It's going to take a long time to build them back. So this is a question that's going to take a couple of generations at least, I would imagine. So we'll see. Here's an idea. There may be more ideas to change. So really where we're going tonight is the idea that it's focused that given that the shamanic archetype emerges and that it's necessary for individual and collective health, and that there's a complicated relationship with the traditions of this land, what are the healthy cultural practices for supporting the expression of this archetype here, now, for people who resonate with this? And I studied with a West African shaman named Malidoma Somé, whose name means friend of the enemy. And he was named that before he was born. and his elders identified before he was born that his job was to come to the West to teach white people how to talk to the spirits. And I love it because it's a kind of reverse missionary work. Basically, they said, unless those people figure out and get it together, we're all going down. So he came and he's been teaching that. And when he teaches, he says, I'm teaching the way my people do it, but you might have to do it differently. You might have to connect with your ancestors and your land and find the new models that work for you. So this is really as part of that model. And it goes back to the question of the Community Healers Council. How do we become the ones the spirits trust to carry the healing into the future? Who we are now, where we are, and what our world looks like. So, archetype. Archetype comes to us from Carl Jung, and they're these innate, unlearned universal tendencies. And they shape us. They're the organizing patterns that are wired into us. And they're kind of like a spiritual DNA or a psychological DNA. And they express themselves in us all the time. There's all sorts of archetypes that we experience in different times and places in our lives. Warrior, healer, mystic, teacher, hermit, victim, lover, martyr. It goes on and on and on. Priestess, hero, saboteur, shaman. It's one of those. And some people will experience some or many. Some people won't experience other ones. But whether we understand them or not, they express themselves through us. And if we ignore them and don't know how to work with them, there's a lot of soul suffering that happens. So if we take an archetypal view of shamanism, that what it does is expresses through people who are called to be walkers between the worlds, to have a foot in each reality, to be a doctor of the living and the dead, one who sees in the dark, technician of ecstasy. Those are all kind of phrases that are used around the definition of shamanism. It's about an ability to consciously engage with the unseen world and to do that in a way that carries healing energy back and forth. It's a very pragmatic, very real action on behalf of healing. And it's about serving as a bridge, as a mediating force between the two worlds. And that movement back and forth is done through tools of consciousness, through altering states of consciousness. Maybe through drumming or dancing or plant medicine, meditation. There are lots of different ways we can tune our psyche, and the shaman becomes an expert in being able to be really clear about which zone they're in and when and how. Being able to go to one and come back, go to this one. So that's the between the worlds. And it's really important that it's a tribal responsibility. It's done on behalf of the community. It's about making the other world manifest for people who may be expressing some other archetype, which is much more about being in this world. And we all hold our place in the community. And that the shamans are responsible for actively tending that relationship so that we're in balance. And the archetype of shamanism is related to the mystic. A little bit different, there's some overlap. A mystic is more reclusive, so the hermit on top of the mountain. In Europe, there were monks who actually they had meditation rooms built in stone into the chapels, and they lived there. It was a complete reclusive space, a monastery full of meditating. That's a mystic. That holds a different kind of anchoring relationship between the world. It's about a very inward, balancing, anchoring space. It's like a tuning fork, that kind of a mystic. And there's an overlap because the archetype of shamanism, when it manifests, it is about becoming something different. So the energy body, the medicine body, the shaman, is tuned differently, but a shaman is a little bit more like a warrior or a kind of a spiritual hero. There's more action involved in the shamanic work. Also related and overlapping a little bit with the archetype of the priest or the priestess. And those are more about public leadership and ceremonial officiation. That's a little bit like the Hierophant in the Tarot. The keeper of the way, this is the path, and when things happen, we know this is the path we go down to find healing. And that really is an aspect of the archetype that I resonate with a lot. When someone dies, here are the rituals that can take us from A to B. And this is the path, and I can walk with you through that path. So it's about that life transition, kind of initiation rituals. And shamanic healing is also ritual-based. Many cultures, it's not a one-on-one, it's like the Navajo sing as a healing ritual. The whole community assembles, and it's a multi-day process on behalf of one person's healing. So there is some priest or priestess work in the shamanic archetype, but they're all slightly different aspects of it. And really it's this acting as a medium between the seen and the unseen, and working specifically with mystical beings for diagnosis and healing. And that's healing of afflictions of the individual or afflictions in the community. And the shaman is also responsible for guiding the souls of the dead to the other world. So that particular branch of it is called being a psychopomp. Psyche is soul, pomp is guide. So people who particularly know that tuning of consciousness. And it emerges in different ways in different people. In traditional cultures, it's often hereditary, that it's carried in the ancestral line, but often there's also still a need to demonstrate it. And I studied a bit with a Nepali woman shaman, and her father had been a shaman, and before he died, he hid his medicine bundle. And she, in a dream, was shown where it was. And so that was the proof that she was the inheritor of his medicine. So it's a combination of the bloodlines and the spirits choosing you. Other cultures, it just goes with the bloodlines. There's lots of different ways of doing it. And sometimes it's spontaneous. Sometimes there's a process where suddenly the veil is thin. And that's a version of what I experienced. And in traditional cultures, that often comes with what's called a shamanic illness. And people, again, talking about Malidoma Somé, he talks about the fact that when people start to act weird in his culture, everyone else sort of gathers around and looks because they know the spirits are involved somewhere. If they're not totally aligned with this world, they got to be aligned with something else, and that's kind of interesting. So this spiritual illness, sometimes it's a psychological illness, and sometimes it's a physical illness. But the act of initiation of going from the opening to being a functioning shaman who's useful in your community is about finding the healing for that illness. And that's where the aspect of the wounded healer comes in. That if you've been through your own experience of illness and affliction, that builds in you a compassion that makes you a better healer working with others. So it's rarely volunteer because it's not an easy path. It asks a lot. And when someone has been identified as one who's on this path, then they need to be initiated. And that's the crystallizing of the energy, the focusing of the energy body. You have to learn the songs and the rituals and make the tools and learn the myths and learn the maps and the practices. So it's a kind of separation from the functioning everyday world to be immersed in the spiritual world. But then if it's done right, you're held in a group of elders who say, this is the way to do it, come with us, a year or two, and then you come back and you'll be useful. You've integrated this, you're functional, you can offer something to your community. And it's no more or less interesting than all the other roles in community. It's just one that people need to play. But it's a way of developing a new spiritual status and a new kind of way of being in service. But that active initiation is what activates the energy. It shifts the energetic structure of your system. An interesting example of this is not exactly a shamanic initiation, but the process of initiation. I lived in the Bay Area for a long time, and I was close friends with a number of men who were involved in this men's community. And they did a regular, there was this weekend initiation process that ran year after year. And before they really became full-fledged members of this community, they had to go through this initiation process. And it was a really profound and intense and somewhat secret. I didn't really know exactly what happened, but I'd seen people off one end and I'd gone to welcome them at the other. And so I knew lots of people who'd been through this process. I moved back to Calgary, and I was at a Halloween party, in fact. So it was, 6 years ago last night. And I met this guy who was wearing a burlap sack and he had a rubber glove on his head. And I think he had glasses with like toilet plungers on them or something. I mean, it wasn't really, I couldn't exactly see what was going on. I was chatting with him and I was chatting with his wife. We were having this lovely conversation and I just couldn't figure out what was happening. I was just magnetized to him. I was like, I want to crawl into his lap. And it wasn't romantic or any kind of attraction. It was just, oh my God, I was so compelled by him. And as the conversation proceeded, it turns out that he'd been through this initiation process. And it was such a, I can get goosebumps now. It changed who he was, and my body was trained to know what men who had been through that feel like and to trust them. And I just trusted him. It was amazing. So that was such a teaching about how initiation changes us at a deep, deep energetic level. And for shamans, the initiations need to continue. And for people who've read about Black Elk, traditional Lakota shaman, and he talked about the fact that in his culture, there were the older shamans would sometimes die because they were setting themselves such extreme initiation. You know, after you spent 4 days without food and water, 3 or 4 times, it's not such a big deal anymore. And you need to do something else. And you need to do something else. So they'd set these intense physical challenges for themselves to push themselves. If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. But having death a little bit there really intensifies the stronger making part of it. So these initiations, they need to continue. And if the shamanic archetype emerges and people aren't initiated, then they can't figure out which world they're in. And it becomes loose. And that was, for a long time, that was my experience. I couldn't function. I just started a PhD program, and I, for the life of me, could not read a paragraph. I couldn't think in a straight line. Just that, I started painting, and I was dreaming, and it was all happening all at the same time, in all the dimensions at the same time. But like adding up my checkbook, couldn't do that. And it took a long time to sort of put things back together and get things in the right compartments so I could say, okay, now I'm going there, but now I'm here. And now I'm grocery shopping, and now I'm here. And for me, there was an initiation process, and it took a long time. It probably took me 10 years. And finding the little bits of support I needed to create a container and a conduit, an alchemical vessel that was strong enough to get me cooked so that I could pop out the other side. So the initiation is really important. And it's what allows you to be sure which reality, which foot is in when. And to be able to be useful, to go there, get what you need, and come back. Receive, translate, deliver. Those 3 words came in a dream very clearly to me, that was the process. So an anthropological view of shamanism is very different than that. It's a way of looking at how it expresses in a particular culture. So the name, the word shaman, shamanism, comes from Mongolia, from the Tungus people, and it's first recorded in use in English in 1688. It was a Dutch explorer who went with a Russian exploration mission to China, and they went through Mongolia. So they came back. So that's how long it's been in this culture. Lots of words, non-English words, are now English words that have been there that long. And the translation is one who knows. That's kind of the closest people can get. And we don't necessarily have a traditional English word for someone who expresses that. Medicine man or medicine woman comes also from Indigenous. We're sort of fishing around for a way to describe what's happening here. And what's important to recognize is that shamanism is related to animism. So shamanism is the expression of the shamanic archetype through someone. Animism is the worldview that holds that the world is alive, that the spirits are present, that what we do has impact, that the past and the present can be connected through ritual. It's a whole package of a worldview. When I talked about the sort of paradigmatic assumptions, those are animistic assumptions. Sometimes it's also called a participatory cosmology. It says that the world is interacting. If I do something, it impacts the world, and then the world acts back, and we can be in conversation. So when we talk about shamanic cultures, it's not actually an accurate phrase. It's really an animistic culture. It's like saying we're a doctorish culture, because the healers in the cultures would be the doctors, the shamans. but it's held within this animistic culture. And it's a kind of relational ontology. Ontology is the study of being. So what is? Everything is relational, as opposed to Western consciousness, which says things are individual, they're separate, and they're material. And so shamanism, the shamanic archetype, emerges most easily through a culture and a worldview that allows those. It's hard for it to emerge through a materialist culture that is really attached to three-dimensional reality and linear time. That answers a lot of questions, but there's a lot that's left out of that. So in an animistic culture, everybody in some way, shape, or form talked to the spirits. You know, before the artist made art or before the hunter went hunting, there was a much more universal relationship with that. But the shamans were the ones who were experts at it, and they did it on behalf of other people. So it's a particular version of it. And there are lots of shamanisms. It's not like there's one, but the practices and beliefs really vary, and the details can contradict a little bit between traditional cultures, but in general there's a universal understanding that there is another world, that we're in relationship with it, and that there are people and practices that can help us do that. But each culture developed their own set of practices and their own interpretation about how to navigate this and how to live in right relationship based on where they were. It's a land-based expression. People who've read David Abram's book, The Spell of the Sensuous, will know language is also an emergence from the land. So that culture, and in particular this how to nurture the expression of the shamanic archetype, is mediated by where it happens, because you're working with different land spirits. So there are ways that we're dealing with a kind of universal underlying energetic reality. And I hesitate to say it's objective, because I don't necessarily think it is objective, but maybe intersubjective, not subjective. Doesn't exist outside of us, doesn't exist inside of us. It's sort of an in-between reality, but we're able to connect with it. So there's a shared reality we're relating to, and we have a common human consciousness, but it happens in different ways. So in the Himalayas, where the land is huge and high and craggy and intense and extreme, the Buddhist cosmologies and the bone shamanism became Tibetan Buddhism. That cosmology has layers and deities and 7 layers above and 7 layers below. It's really, really complex. And it's in a land that's very complex. And in Africa, where the other world is right there, it's stark and raw and absolutely present. The cosmology is really raw and really simple, and it's right present all the time. So in this place here, where the bow meets the elbow and the foothills of the Rockies, there's a certain context and container that our approach needs to reflect, because we're not doing it individually. It's not a human process. It's a process of being in relationship across the human, other than human divide. And we all come from land somewhere. I remember being in Peru and learning that their creation story, there was a deity, a couple, and they had all these children. These brothers and sisters went out, and each brother and sister went to a different spring, and they emerged from the land through these springs, and they formed this tribe, and they each carried a different seed of language. And that's where the people came from. They came from the springs. And I thought, well, that's cool, but that's Peru. And then I was online reading about the McNabs, which is my mother's lineage, and the ancient history of the McNabs is that we emerged from a spring in Scotland. It's like, we did come from a spring, but it's not here. So now I'm here, and my McNab spring's back there. So what do we do here? How do we live of this land when we're new to this land? And how do we enter into right relationship with this land and the beings of this land when there are all these aspects that are kind of confusing? We don't have history, we have colonialism, we've got a whole bunch of ancestry. Those are the questions that really fascinate me. So how do we meet it here, given all the things that we have to deal with? So shamanism and the shamanic archetype has always emerged. And in Western culture, it continues to emerge. I mean, the witches in Europe were spellcasters and herbalists, and they were using Amanita muscaria and entheogenic mushrooms. There was a whole vivid life of relationship between the worlds. One of the things that I love was this idea that off the western coast of Scotland, where some of my ancestors are from, sailors wouldn't go sailing unless the local medicine woman had given them a string of wind knots. And she would blow a spell of wind into these knots, and if your ship was becalmed, you'd untie the knot and that would call the wind. So they're very pragmatic. Like, they had ships. It's more real, I think, in a way when we think about them that way. So it was alive in Europe, and the impact of the witch burnings and the Inquisition, of course, decimated that. And many of us, I think, experienced some version of that in our own memory of this is a little bit dangerous to go down this path. Another interesting line of that lineage is ancient polytheistic Greece. Greece was a huge long civilization, lasted for thousands of years, and in the earlier part of it, there was a traditional healing model, and it's like traditional Chinese medicine for China or Ayurvedic medicine from India, and it was our Western spiritual holistic healing model. And it was based on a deity named Asclepius, and he was a part human, part god, and he was a dream healer. So there were these temples to Asclepius, Asclepian dream temples, and people would come. They were all over the Greek islands. People would come, and there were temple priestesses and priests, and there would be a long incubation process where they'd slowly work through the ritual process until the night that they would sleep in the temple, which was a cave temple, and Asclepius would come. And he was a big bearded man with a staff and a snake and a dog, and he would offer healing. And there are thousands of inscribed tablets around Greece thanking Asclepius for the healing. Either he would do the healing or he would prescribe what the healing was needed. And these temples were a direct relationship with the spiritual healing powers, but they had baths, and there was massage, and they had all the holistic support around them. So we had that, just like traditional Chinese medicine, just like Ayurvedic medicine, but it's been lost. And one of my favorite stories is during World War I, there were some British soldiers who were camping on a Greek island. And it turns out that this island had been one of the locations of an Asclepian temple. And they finally went to their commanders and they said, "We have to leave. This crazy guy with a stick and a dog and a beard keeps coming in our dreams and he's freaking us out." And I did a 10-day workshop on Asclepian dream healing. And with some folks, there's a psychiatrist named Ed Tick who does a lot of work with veterans and trauma, but he also has a Greek history and has written a lot about Asclepian dream healing. And the dream healing experience I had that crossed between being awake and being asleep, this merging of this world and the other, that involved opening the door of my cabin and having a coyote standing right there. It just went on and on and on. I was like, okay, it's Asclepius. He's got something. It's really powerful. So that's another aspect of how it has emerged and how it's been met. But we don't have a culturally held vision of that anymore. And many of us are drawn, so if we move forward from those historical references, what do we do now when it's happening? And I think that the differentiation between animism and shamanism is important, because I think many of us are drawn to animism, to live in a world that's alive, and to live in ritual reciprocity with the world, and to be tuned in to the spirits who come in our dreams. And that whole process is available to everybody, and is in a way our kind of human indigenous birthright, because we all come from tens of thousands of years of living that way. We've only been living this way for a tiny little aspect of it. But in this culture, we don't have a space to practice animism. Most of what we have are workshops on shamanism. So we take ourselves to that instead. And it's a growing process. But there's a differentiation between, oh yeah, this is how I live, and I am coming back and forth and I'm doing this on behalf of my community. So this capacity for conversation with the other world is in all of us to some degree. And, learning to shamanic journey can be really useful for that. And we'll all probably occupy different places along that spectrum. So what are the options for modern people? And there are a few different ways to do it. So you feel as either the draw to animism or shamanism or something. It's all sort of related as we experience it now. We haven't parsed it out a bit. What are the options? Well, one is drawing from existing cultures, right? From current existing Indigenous cultures who have a continuous line of that teaching. And for some people, that's a perfect fit. And depending on the tradition, you have to be careful, because does the tradition actually welcome you? Does it want students to come? And what's required of you if you take it up? We really need to, if we're going to do this, learn to meet those traditions on their own terms. And they're not transactional, commercial acquisition paths, they're relational paths. So if you're entering into that tradition, it's probably based on a web of relationships, and it's about becoming part of the community and part of the family. In a way, that means you should be sending money if it's a cold winter. There's a whole different kind of set of relationships that may or may not exist in those traditions. You think about Joseph Boyden and the whole conversation about, is he Indigenous or is he not? And I think the most interesting conversations are not about what they call blood quantum, like can you actually trace it back? But is he claimed by a community with whom he's in relationship? That would have given him the qualifications he needs. Being Indigenous is a relational aspect. So it's not transactional. You need to respect that aspect of the teachings. And respect the protocol. Right? So you can learn it. Are you allowed to teach other people? You can learn it. Maybe you can do that and you can come and meet it. Are you allowed to charge for it? Some traditions allow that and some don't. So people who do that, there are lots of white Western people who find their way into right relationships with those traditions. But we need to meet them really on their terms, not on our terms. A friend of mine is the minister at St. Stephen's Anglican Church. And I'm in churches a lot at the pulpit doing funerals, but I'm not very often in empty churches. And I went for lunch with him one day and we started the church. And I just remember walking into that space and being so moved by the intensity of energy in there. And in a way envious that there was this huge, long lineage of practices and traditions and songs and an energetic field that church created, that he was tapping into, that congregation was tapping into. Christianity's got a lot of complications to it too, and it's just not what I'm called to. But there's something juicy about the strength of what's in ancient traditions. And so people who are called to work with existing traditions tap into some of that. And the flip side of that is that they work because they haven't changed. And so if you're going to follow that, there's probably a requirement that you don't change them, that you follow them in their completion, because that's meeting them on their terms. And in a way, I wanted that. When I started having these experiences and the world was just popping and I couldn't make sense of it, I just ached for a group of elders to say, okay, do this. Come with us, do this, follow these techniques. We'll do the rituals and hold you in the space and you'll come up the other end. And I actually tried to connect with different kinds of Indigenous teachers, and a number of them said to me, sorry, you can't. Your path is to learn directly from the spirits and to figure out a new way. And it hurt. I wanted to actually go a path that somebody knew, but that wasn't my way. So this work I'm doing now grows out of that in a way. And it was hard, it was frustrating. And different traditions have different approaches. Some are welcoming, some are not welcoming. When I was in Peru, the teachers there, we did one ritual, a Despacho Ritual, people are familiar with that, and they would pour in poppy seeds. And when they poured them in, they'd make prayers. They called us Los Místicos. We're the mystical tourists. We're coming down to study with the shamans. Los Místicos. Well, that's us. And there was a big train of people coming down because here's this tradition that was So separated for so long, it's maintained so much of their originality. And they poured these poppy seeds into the offering and they said, "May los místicos come with the abundance of ants. Please come and please learn what we have to say." A little bit like Malidoma, because we need you to take it back, but also because our coming was revaluing the ancient traditions. Suddenly the young people in the communities were more interested in this because these white folks were coming and studying it. So it's all complex. And then does it change when it gets delivered to people who come down on a 2-week trip? You know, there's all sorts of questions. But working with those traditions, keeping all those questions in mind is important. And then there are people who are pursuing it in some kind of way that's a modified version of existing traditions. So Reiki would be one of those, or acupuncture, astrology, tarot. And those are existing traditions that aren't necessarily held in cultural, and some of them are a little bit, but cultural enclaves, but there's a long line. And then there are new social movements, and that's kind of where I situate the work I do. And it's a blend of evolutionary and reconstructionist, sort of figuring out, and they're called syncretic traditions because they merge often a lot of different traditions. They come from different sources. And some of them come from sort of established sources we can research, and some of them come from direct relationship with the spirits and learning through altered states of consciousness. And that's what we're doing in the Healers Council. We're saying, how do we open ourselves and become a vessel through which the teaching in this land can emerge? And how can we train ourselves to be able to understand and hear what it is? So historically, those new models have been esoteric and occult groups like the Order of the Golden Dawn and Rosicrucians, the Freemasons. That's all deeply ritual. And they were doing magic and scrying and astral travel, things like that. Then there are contemporary new models. So the next wave of that is things like Wicca and Neo-Paganism. I was really involved for a long time in the reclaiming tradition, which is one version of that through San Francisco and Starhawk. It's an earth-based new religious movement. That's what it's termed as. Another one is core shamanism and Michael Harner's work. And you know, there's some question about how core it is and how universal it is, but he's tried to pull some of the primary aspects of altered states of consciousness and the work from that and create a model that people can follow. But the key is it's about developing the skill to be able to learn and to be in relationship, to be taught directly. And then there are more reconstructionist ones like Norse and heathen, and where there was a tradition, but there's no direct line. So they're going back to the folklore and the myth and the story and the art, trying to figure out, well, what is happening in that picture? What's that? And reconnecting with some of those spirits who haven't been connected with for a long time. And it's interesting, I knew a few folks in the Bay Area who are doing it. And there's something really powerful to waking up and opening a gateway to a spirit who hasn't been in conversation. It takes a while to wake them up, and then they come in often with quite some enthusiasm. So entheogenic work, working with sacred plant medicine, is another one of those. Sometimes we're sort of pulling it from different places. And then there are things like systemic constellation work, which is drawing on some indigenous traditions and being a way of opening the gates, but not in a traditional ritual way. So the Healers Council is part of this. How do we do this? And I think the core part of what we're doing in the Healers Council is trying to do it as a collective. There's a way that the first wave of kind of contemporary reemergence of the shamanic theme in Western culture kind of has a mortgage to Western culture. We had to do it from within the culture. So the first wave of that was coming from within that. So it was still quite individualistic. We look at Michael Harner's work, there's a shaman and there's a client, and often client comes to shaman, they close the door and they do the healing and then the person leaves. And it can be really profound and really healing, but it's very individual and it's very linear. From, to, give, receive. And that I think is a reflection of this Western, we're still sort of beholden to that Western structure. When I think if we meet shamanism really on its own terms, it's coming from a much more animistic, much more relational, much more collective process, where it's not this person is out of balance because it's within them. It's that there's a whole community out of balance, and if someone has an affliction, it's a reflection of something they're carrying on behalf of the community. You know, Malidoma talks about his brother getting really ill, and the shaman's diagnosing that his father hadn't properly tended the shrine. He was supposed to tend the water shrine, and he didn't. And so this shrine not being tended by this person meant that this person got ill. So it changes the whole picture. And now, you know, someone gets cancer. We say, oh, this person has cancer. Well, we collectively have created this toxic world where it happens to have been surfacing in their body, but it's not really their cancer. It's our cancer. So that opening up and starting to hold the experiences, both the afflictions and the healing, more as a collective process, I think really is the next iteration of where we need to go as white folks, trying to figure out what the healthy expression of the shamanic archetype is. That it's ritual, and this is what I really experience in my work with families, is that there's no straight line between who's giving and who's receiving. When the ritual is done properly, the giving and the receiving, and I'm leading it, but I'm having it's just so circular and web-like that's a richer, more collective, more interconnected way of considering healing. And yeah, that the afflictions are held in the community, that healing is held in the community, and that the shamanic archetype is held in the community. So it may be expressing itself through one person, but that person is held in a web. And I've done work where I just know I'm going way out on the diving board and I need people back here. So I have to organize people to be here to bring me back again. Like some stuff you just can't do alone. So things happen. I mean, many of the reasons I don't use the word shaman will probably be clear to you now, but one of the reasons is that I don't know if we can fully express that archetype in a Western individualist materialist culture. I think it is by definition a collective expression. And so the Healers Council is about exploring what is it to blur the boundaries between individuals a little bit, allow us each to hold our own uniqueness, but from that place of individuality, then connect. And what kind of container and vessel and channel can we connect? So back to the beginning, it's as though Western Europeans and those of us inculcated in Western culture have lost our Indigenous minds. Right? And we need to refine those Indigenous minds in order to meet these teachings in a way that express them. And that it's about restoring right relationship, and that's almost impossible to do from the perspective of Western culture. Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. We need a new set of tools to do this. And Council is tracking one small piece of this. How do we literally change ourselves? And when I was going through those experiences, I remember having these sensations of this experience that was so completely off the charts in terms of three-dimensional reality. And then what I sort of, quote unquote, knew to be true. And it was like two ends of hot wires hitting each other. Like, these just can't exist together. And then as I continued to work and kind of got it figured out, I was able to expand things so they could exist. And that's a little bit what Council does. How can we expand ourselves so that these things that we aren't given support for out here become real and just become a normal part of who we are? So I'm going to end it there, and we're going to do some questions and answers. But before I do that, I just love to have people turn to someone you don't know. We'll just take 5 minutes maybe and just have a little bit of chat time about your impressions and your responses. Just short, and then we'll do a Q&A and a little bit of wrap-up. So no focus other than, what did you take out of this? What do you have to say about it? You can wrap up your conversations and just bring your attention back up here. So we'll take a few moments now, and I'd be curious on people's reflections or thoughts and questions.
I have a question. So when you talk about creating the right relationship with the land that you're in, so like say you're here and then if you move to like a desert, you would re-establish your practices to connect with the land of the desert? Is that so
Yeah.
it's always constantly changing if you're moving kind of idea?
If you're moving, yeah.
Okay.
And I carry a little tobacco in my purse when I fly, and I land at a new airport. I drop a little tobacco and say, hi, I'm here. I'll be here for a week, and then I'm going home again. It's just naming that's your presence is a something there. So how to be a good guest if you're a guest, or a good inhabitant if you're an inhabitant. And when I come back, and I say, it's nice to be home. Here's some tobacco for you too.
How was your PhD work accepted in the academic environment? Because I know it can be very hard just to get into it, because I'm kind of where you were 15 years ago, like highly academic.
That was a project. So I went to university in San Francisco, which was really open-minded to all of this, but it had been this big, open-minded, progressive university for many years, and they were just in the process of getting certified by the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, which kind of moves them out, and they were getting a little more like this. So I had to do a lot, and my dissertation might be interesting to you. I actually had to write 2 complete methods chapters. I had to say, I'm doing this research using an Indigenous methodology, and this is how I justify it using a Western methodology. So it took a lot of academic argument to say this can't be met through this lens. It could be, and this is how you do it, and I understand how you do it. But actually to meet it and to understand what it is, you have to take this lens. And my dreams are my data, and they actually are acceptable data, even though they can't be cited. So it was a huge, and it was a good intellectual exercise because it gave me a confidence to stand in that. But it was a big process, and it took a lot of academic gymnastics to make that happen. But we need to. Shifting of paradigms. We have to push it in different edges in different ways. Yeah, if you're curious, I'd be happy to talk to you more about that later. Anybody else?
What drew you to San Francisco, and what draws you to Calgary?
I was born here, and I have a lot of people buried here, and this is just beyond a doubt my place. I went to San Francisco specifically to go to this university. This opening happened a few months before I left. And I was like, oh, the world is not normal. And I'm going to the center of not normalness. It was perfect. and I didn't know what was going on. I got there, and people are like, oh, you're having shamanic initiation. It's nothing. Just, take this course, do this. It was all, in fact, the school I was at, there's a researcher named Stan Groff who really explored, he is an academic in psychology, it's called a Spiritual Emergence. He's done a ton of research on it. So he was a professor at this university. So I said, I think I'm having a spiritual emergence. I said, okay, you can take sick leave for a semester. I was in the right place. But it's really clear this is where I'm supposed to be. And part of it is, in a way that, particularly with the tar sands, that Calgary is a heart of a lot of stuff that's happening that's impacting the rest of the world. And it's easy to go do healing work where it's groovy and easy, but this doing it here has an impact that I feel like is part of, I miss it all. When I was in the Bay Area, I could just kind of send out these tentacles and plug into this whole spiritual substrate of a field where this was just established. And it was so easy to be held by it, and it's just not here. You get Hummers or something and go like that. But this is my place.
Well, in keeping with that, when you were talking about Calgary and where we're situated, Calgary is a massive transition point, right? We've got a nexus point on Nose Hill. We are completely ruled by winds, either from the ocean or from the Arctic. We are in a transition between the plains and the mountains, right? Like Calgary's a really, unless you're really connected to wind, Calgary's actually a really hard place to get a handle on.
It's a lot easier than the Bay Area. You go down here, you get granite. You go down there, you get tectonic plates. So, but yeah, so they're all, and people will associate different ways. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question or an observation in terms of, I just feel this draw towards so many different modalities and so many different healers and I think I gain from all of them. And they basically are based in the urban worlds, but I find when I come into an urban world, I feel so bombarded by energy, and I'm not just talking traffic, which would be my first visual, boundary, but also other people's energies. So I think, it's that space of giving yourself space in an urban, I don't even know how I would do it, because I do get drawn to living in the city, but I live in the country. Give myself some space in this urban world to allow myself to grow instead of being bombarded from the inside.
I think we're being asked to develop tools that work in urban spaces. It's not easy. It's, maybe those of us who are here now came because we knew there was a big challenge to be faced. And it's easy to meditate in a monastery. And it's easy to tune in the middle of an old-growth forest. And it's easy to tune in the Bay Area. But there are lots of places where it's not so easy, where we still need to develop those practices. So I think it's a balance between what feeds you and how do you get restored and get balance, and then how do we develop them in urban places where we have cell phones and traffic? Because we're going to have more of that, not less. And we need these practices more than ever.
Particularly when so many people don't know that they need those boundaries, because they're getting bombarded and their true nature can't be expressed.
Yeah. And for me, working in Calgary, I very clearly, and it's always interesting to me because it's so not about time and space, this world, but it's about time and space for me. There's this bubble of unancestralized settler dead here. The unancestralized settler dead. That we have not conveyed our dead to the other side. And it's a kind of spiritual pollution. You go camping and you have the garbage, you take it home with you. Right? There's a leave no trace, tidy up after yourself kind of ethic. And when we just let our dead go, some of them make it where they need to go, but some of them don't. And it's kind of messy out there. And so for me, it's not just the living, there's a bunch of extra that need to get where they need to go. So that inspires a lot of my work. Not so much to go back and fix that bubble of past ones. I do a little bit of that, but more learn paths so that we can do it ourselves.
Would that be created because a lot of people didn't have family to honor their dead, or family to even bury them?
Lots of different ways. Often it's ritual. It's ritual that they're not conveyed. There's a whole, this is my whole other shtick, is the dead part, but they're newborns in that field, and they need a little bit of help. Rest in peace. Like there's a difference between dying and being successfully dead, and that's the ritual action that gets you there. There, and then Liz.
Can you explain a little more about what you were talking about regarding there's this understanding of a pattern or an energy with the land, and then people who come over from a foreign place. How do you personally integrate or make yourself welcome to, like the transplant or whatever you call it? Do you lend yourself entirely to what has always been, or do you bring something new and relate? And is there a rejection there of some kind?
For whatever reason, my path has not been to follow traditional established teachings, which would be to study the spiritual teachings of the people of this land and this place who have a whole history of how to be in conversation with it. It might be easier if that was my path, but it's not. No, it'd be harder in its own ways. So it's this whole aspect of creating new cultural models. How do we do that? And for me, it's about relationship building and just an ongoing, at a physical level, what is this land? How do the seasons change here? What happens in my yard? Who lives in my yard? To more of a meditative attunement, processes I do that just try and harmonize me with the energy of this place. If it's a tuning fork, how do I start to vibrate in the resonance of it? Because it's my land. And having dead buried here makes a difference. For me, that's why I'm here, because they're here. And I think putting your dead in the land does something to say you're really here. But we live in a mobile society. And I've made a commitment to be here, but we can't all be in the places we think we're going to stay in. So we need to learn somehow ways to move respectfully and stay connected. I don't know, there's a whole bunch of new questions to be asked about how that happens. Yeah. Liz and then Sophie.
Well, I don't know, my question was about death ritual and what it was like years ago. And so there was a 3-day process and then the burial. And now in modern times, we see more, they're choosing not to have a service because the person said they didn't want anything, and how that leaves, how that leaves the rest of the family, and also burial. And a lot of people are choosing not even to go back to the land. They want their ashes spread, and some of them don't even care where their ashes go. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I can. That's sort of my other hat, right? But a couple of things in there. One is this idea that afflictions are not personal. So whose death is it? Is it the dying person whose death it is, or is it the community who's experiencing? Because the dying person's dying, okay, that's important and that's big, but someone is having their spouse die, or their parent, or their sibling, or their child, and that's transformative in their life. And the whole system has to reconfigure when one person leaves. So it is this profound collective experience, and that's my interest in doing ritual work at death in community, because everybody has to change. And yeah, lots of people say they don't care, and we don't care until suddenly we can't find the body. And then people go to incredible lengths to retrieve lost bodies. But when we have them, somehow we don't realize that it actually matters. And just these are little hopping tidbits through this, but that there are 4 ways to make offerings: earth, air, fire, and water. And there are 4 ways to return our bodies to the earth: earth, air, fire, and water. We can burn them, we can bury them, we can have a sky burial, we can put them in the ocean. And so whatever the process is, in a way, we become the final offering. And so our death and our disposition is a profound final act of returning. So when I first sort of fell onto this path, there was this terror in me that I would lose, that my family would, it was ridiculous. There was no chance of that happening, but somehow I thought, oh my God, they're never going to love me anymore. My friends are never going to, everybody's going to leave me. It was this visceral, totally non-logical, but terrifying thought, I'm going to lose everybody. I'm going to be all alone and weird. And now I'm just weird with lots of company. It's great. And someone said to me, if the people who love you, if the love is true, it'll sustain. If you become more of who you are, and they loved you before, they'll love you again. And it's happened. People who I never thought would have been able to walk this path with me are still with me. And some people did fall off, but they weren't the true ones. So that's one, is that it's amazing where people who really love you can go. And the other thing is that when I found a place where I could be whole, I didn't need it so much from them. That I was trying to get reflection from people who just could not see me. And so I needed to find a place where I could get reflected by people who could see me. Then I could figure out who I was, and then I could get stable in who I was. And then I could go to the people who just absolutely do not have those glasses. And I could see them for who they were and not expect them to be more than they are. Because they are what they are, and I'm not going to get this from them. I'm going to get this from these, but I'm going to get something else. And we have something else. So it was getting stable and getting reflected that let me get grounded in that, so then I could not need that from them.
I have a question about initiation. So you talked about that you have to be initiated, and is that something that other people initiate you? But it doesn't sound like necessarily you're following one specific path on that initiation. Like it's initiation that can happen in stages in different places. Is that?
So read the dissertation. That's step one, because that's all what it's about. But we need to develop new initiatory practices. And so part of the initiatory journey is leaving who you were and then being in this in-between liminal zone before you become who you're going to be. And then you're welcomed back in your community as this new person. And that's, when you get married, when you have a baby, all those sorts of initiations. And initiating the shamanic archetype is the same thing. And this in-between is called the liminal realm. Limin is threshold, doorway. You have your foot in one room and one foot in one room and one foot in the other. So in a successful initiation, you're held by a container of elders or community or structure. It's not just structure. There need to be people who hold that. So you can come undone, like the caterpillar comes undone in the cocoon, and then be rebuilt. So you go through that liminal process. But if you don't have that container, it becomes what's called liminoid, which is sort of free-floating and ungrounded, and it's like recirculating. You can just bounce around and around and around. And it took me, I did a lot of that, because I had to find the place and the framework and cobble it together from here. And in the end, it was this community, in a way, that played a big role in it. But it was doing tons of therapy and getting my own personal stuff figured out, doing energy work, doing homeopathy, and starting a shamanic training program that had an initiatory aspect to it. And it was the traditional Andean Peruvian approach. So I was initiated in that, including going to Peru and having those initiatory transmissions. So that was my version of it. But it's not one that I'm connected to now. I dismantled my mesa, which was my medicine bundle. I gave it back. It's like, thank you very much. This helped me, but it's not my medicine. So I feel like that's part of the work we need to do, is figure out how we do that in community and create a container. Initiation is about getting cooked. You actually have to have a strong enough container that you can come apart and reform and pop out.
I'm thinking as you're saying that back to me that it's not a real hierarchy. I think it's just another symptom of the here and now, what we're working in. Does that make sense?
Of scarcity, and there's only so much, and I get it, so you can't, and that kind of competition part of it.
Yeah.
Kind of that Western.
Yeah.
lens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my approach to much of that really comes from these teachings through Dina Metzger, and she talks about the fifth world. There are many prophecies that we're entering a new era. The age of Aquarius. The fifth world is I can't remember, I think it's Hopi or Navajo prophecy. There's new change. In Peru, they talked about Pachacuti, which is the changing. It's like the pancake flips. You were in this era, and now you're in that era. Of that image, right? It's flipped. There's no two ways about it. So Dina talks about consciously living in the fifth world. We can't try and change the fourth world. We just have to move there and start living by those rules. And she's got an article called 19 Ways to the Fifth World. And it's beautiful. You can download it from her site. It's if you're in the Healers Council, it's in the resource section in there. It's just, every time you have an opportunity, instead of engaging with the here and now that is so dysfunctional, choose to live there. Choose to live there and make that so appealing that it pulls everything there, instead of trying to combat this. Take one more question? No. There we go. That was it. My goodness. Perfect. So just in wrapping up, if you're interested in the Healers Council, the way it works is that current members have first dibs on registering. So everyone who's coming back from last semester has. And there's an early bird discount rate which goes till Sunday night. And then the rate goes up after Sunday. And so we'll send a link tonight with the different resources I've talked about. I'll send a link to the page that has that information. I offer 4 needs-based youth discounts if you're under 40, which is young in some contexts. And one of the beautiful things about the council is we've had big spreads. One semester we had a 21-year-old and a 73-year-old, and pretty good spread in there. So if you're interested in one of those discounts, just email me, and we can talk about that. Yeah, I think that's it. Lots of resources. I really appreciate having a place to bring this. In a dream, I was shown really clearly this sort of pipe of information coming in, and this is before I was stepping out doing this work more, and that the pipe comes in and it has an out, and that unless this out goes somewhere, the rest can't come in. And in a way, it's having people to listen. This is where it's reciprocal. I actually can't do this unless there are people to receive it. So I'll be here. I'd love to hear people's reflections. If you have thoughts or comments, sometimes I'm engaged in more experiential stuff, so I'm just talking and then you're all going to go. But I'd love to, either by email or if you have reflections, was there something useful or helpful about this? That's really helpful for me to hear too. And this will be a series of lectures. They'll start again in January on the first Wednesday of the month. And so we'll let you know about that as it happens. And thank you all very much for coming.